The last time I spoke, as I said, I wanted to do this in a very conversational way. And I do intend to follow that pattern here. So I'm not lecturing to you, I'm just having a talk, as it were. And afterwards, of course, there'll be Q&A, so we can cover all sorts of other things. The last time we spoke, I talked about the whole question of Tibetan history and what is Tibetan history and the periodization of Tibetan history and really the beginnings of Tibet. What I want to talk about this time, and there's a sort of chronological flow to this, although I do digress, and I may go off to other places as well. But what I want to talk about essentially is the period from empire to fragmentation, which I think is very important in terms of forming the idea of Tibetans, certainly, and also a very important period for what follows and what proceeds from that in terms of Tibetan history and even Tibetan identity, if I can really sweep over centuries here. The Tibetan Empire, if I'm going to start with the Tibetan Empire, of course, and I'm starting from the late Tibetan Empire, it was a very powerful entity. I think many of you are aware of the fact that 763, the Tibetans, for a very, 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 very brief period, occupied the Chinese capital, the Tang capital at Chang'an. And it was also a period in which the Tibetans occupied the Silk Road. In other words, what you had is really a world empire. The Tibetan Empire was a world empire. And when you look, as I think I said last time, when you look at the Tang records, the Tibetan Empire occupies two chapters in the Jiu Tang Shu, the Xin Tang Shu, the Old Tang history and the New Tang history, basically putting it on the same level as the other major adversaries or neighbors of the Tang, the Uyghurs and the Turks. There's no doubt but that the Tibetan Empire was extremely important and extremely powerful. There was an article about 2 months ago in one of these sort of military foreign policy publications that's put out, which, and I thought this was carrying things a bit too far. The person who wrote it was not a specialist, so one should be kind. But he said something to the effect that the threat that Tibet posed to the Tang is still on the minds of China's modern leaders, and that's why they need to control Tibet. Now, I think that's carrying things a bit too far. It's a bit too atavistic, and history has gone in all sorts of different directions. I don't think the cadres of the Communist Party are pouring through the Jiu Tang Shu and the Xin Tang Shu as they devise modern policy. But it was an extremely important period. The Tibetan Empire was an empire. And one of the interesting things that we find about it, of course, in Chinese writings is the acknowledgement, if you will, that the Tibetan ruler was an emperor, that he was not a king. I mean, this is a confusion which also enters into later Tibetan writings. Even Tibetans will sometimes write about the rulers of this period as kings, Gyebo, when in point of fact they were emperors, Zampo. And there's really no other way to deal with the term Zampo, and we find in some unofficial writings, not official Chinese writings from the period, of course, use the term, they just transcribe the term into Chinese, Zambu. So it's just transcribed so that one doesn't have to define it. In other words, one doesn't have to define it. And this, of course, is done with all sorts of neighboring peoples. The Xiongnu ruler was a Shanyu, and you find this in Chinese sources for Turks and for Mongols, Han and Khan, without actually giving equivalents to them. But there's a very interesting lexicon that came, I believe, from Dunhuang. It's a Tibetan Chinese lexicon. And that's, not surprising because one needed lexicons for people to deal with each other. But It has Zambo, the name for the Tibetan ruler during the imperial period, and the equivalent is Tufan Tianzi, which is to say the son of heaven, which means emperor, the son of heaven of the Tibetans. So there is an awareness that official requirements aside, in other words, that there be only one son of heaven. And by the way, the Tibetans had the same conceit. If one looks at the Treaty 821, 822 that was concluded between China, on one part of it, the Tibetans actually used the term Je. Gyalje, I think is the term they use, Gyalje, which means the Chinese Lord, which is very, very lesser. It's a very lesser title, and that's what's used in one portion in the Tibetan there. So we have this Gyalje, which is used in that treaty, and all of this really is just a way of saying that indeed different peoples with different state structures considered their rulers to be emperors, that is to be above kings, but to be emperors, much like the Tang emperor was an emperor. Okay, so this is a period in which one can say that Tibet reaches its height in military power, certainly, and indeed, I talked a little bit about this last time. It's the period in which the Tibetans reached their furthest demographic spread. What I said last time was that essentially you have a dynamic movement out of south-central Tibet, and it rolls over the plateau and extends beyond the plateau. And when the smoke and dust clears, everybody, and again, I said this very melodramatically, from the shores of Kokonor in the east to the borders of Kashmir in the west, everybody is the descendant of a monkey bodhisattva and a rock ogress. And this creation of a sense of people, or a common recognition of a people. And again, I'm trying to keep this away from modern notions of nationalism because they are very specific to the modern era. I'm not being atavistic about this, but nevertheless, there is a recognition here very similar to what you have in the formation of the Arabs as a people. And this is also where...
I'm sorry, but for those of us who weren't here last month, what period are you talking about?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm talking about the imperial period is the 7th to the 9th centuries, and then I'll be more specific as I go on from that, okay? And I'm really talking about the late period. That is the latter part of the empire here. But in general, I'm talking about the 8th and 9th centuries here. And this is also a period in which Buddhism, of course, is very prominent within Tibetan civilization. Within the growth of Buddhism, I should say, is very prominent. But it's not all-encompassing. And the narrative that one usually gets, the narrative that one is usually given about this late imperial period, and about the collapse of the empire in the imperial period, and the development of, and the beginning of the period of fragmentation. The narrative that one usually gets is that ultimately there was a conflict between those who favored Buddhism in the empire, and the emperors who favored Buddhism, and some nobles who disliked Buddhism, and wanted to maintain the quote-unquote Pön religion. All of this is very, very problematic. And I guess when I say that it's problematic, you can pretty much assume that I'm going to give some sort of alternate explanation or semi-alternate explanation. The general narrative that you get, the general narrative that we wind up with is that, of course, you have the pro-Buddhist emperors. Now you have Chisong Detsen in the 8th century, in the second half of the 8th century. And it is really only during the time of Chisong Detsen that Tibet has its first monastery. There are temples, but the first monastery, Samye, is in the second half of the 8th century. Now, if you remember that, it's in the middle of the, this is the second half of the 8th century, it's the middle of the 7th century. The middle of the 7th century that Buddhism supposedly comes to Tibet during the time of Songtsen Gampo, you have a period of effectively over a century with not a monastery in Tibet. Temples, yes. But also, you don't have Tibetan monks. This also comes from the time of Chisung Detsen, the beginnings of a Tibetan Sangha. So we're talking about the, say, the middle of the second half of the 8th century, and then things collapse in the 840s. So we're talking about a very, very short period in which you have such an intense Buddhicization, if you will. I don't know if there is such a word, of Tibet. And nevertheless, it is very, very, very intense. We know that the work that was going on, the work of translation, and there was an awful lot of translation going on during the imperial period. And of course, that's extremely important. One does not have Buddhism without Buddhist texts, without Buddhist teachings. And so, of course, you need translation. And so it's going on at a very rapid pace, particularly after the founding of the monastery of Samye. The support for a Sangha, for a Buddhist Sangha, begins very, very intensely as well. Let me see if I can, sometimes I even confuse myself when I try to explain things like that. The narrative, the idea that you just have, these awful ministers who just don't like the Buddha Dharma. They hate the Buddha Dharma, and they want to get rid of, the emperor. I mean, they want to get rid of Rinpoche, who is one of the last emperors, and Senele, who preceded him. They don't like him because they are all very supportive of Buddhism, very pro-Buddhist. And so the story is that you have these anti-Buddhist nobles and ministers who really, really dislike Buddhism. They just hate the Buddha Dharma. They want to get rid of it. They want to have Pön back there. And so they eventually wind up engineering the assassination of Rinpoche, 838, and putting his brother, the anti-Buddhist Lang Dharma, on the throne. And as I say, the narrative that you sometimes get, and for a long time this was the traditional narrative, I'm happy to say that within Tibetan studies, of course, this narrative is now, how should I say, being reworked. It's simply not as simplistic as that, because the idea is that within the 4 years that Lang Dharma was on the throne, he destroyed Buddhism almost totally and left only little embers, and this is the metaphor that is used, little embers of the faith that are left. And there are some problems with this. I mean, there are a lot of problems with this, and I think some of it comes from just framing it as a religious issue. That at the end of the Tibetan Empire, there was a conflict between Buddhism and the indigenous religion. There are a lot of problems with this. One is the question of what is the indigenous religion of Tibet? What is Pön, in fact? And what I'm going to say is that Pön, as we know it, is really from the 11th and 12th centuries. That what you have at this time, and I think I said some of this earlier, the forging of the Tibetans as a people means that you're dealing with people prior to this who scattered across the Tibetan plateau, who have people with diverse languages, diverse traditions, diverse beliefs and belief systems, that there is no one overarching religion in Tibet. During this time of division, prior to the formation of the Tibetans as a people, they're not all practicing something called Pön. There, of course, is something called Pön. And the Pön religion as we know it now does certainly have elements that are pre-Buddhist, that we can say are absolutely pre-Buddhist, but that it existed in anything like the form that it has now, which is very heavily influenced by the milieu in which it is found, which is a Buddhist milieu, that is not really probable. So we have to return to this question of the assassination of Rinpoche and the supposed destruction of Buddhism in Tibet. Now, Buddhism had been given a very, very strong amount of support from the empire. And then all of a sudden it seems to suffer this catastrophe. The question is this what Lang Dharma did? You read that Lang Dharma closed up the monasteries, threw out the monks, and did all of these terrible things until such time as Hlalung Pelki Dorji, the monk, could take it no more and killed Lang Dharma. Well, one of the problems with this is the famous Tibetan scholar Samten Karme has actually shown that Lang Dharma, first of all, was not as anti-Buddhist as that. In fact, he found a decree from Langdharma that was actually, one could even say it was, accommodating of Buddhism. And the funny thing is that when he wanted to publish that in Dharamsala, it shocked so many people that they basically said no and they wouldn't publish it. They eventually did publish it, but it just upset sensibilities, as it were. The other thing is, this is 4 years, and one is supposed to say that he uproots Buddhism so totally that it is practically forgotten. Now, you must excuse me if I keep saying, I think I said this to you last time, but I don't know if I use this as a metaphor, or not a metaphor, as an equivalent. There's a famous story when Stalin was isolating Trotsky and Trotsky's supporters. And Stalin could do this very well. He went to them one by one. Trotsky was someone who could speak to 1,000 people and mesmerize them, but one-on-one he was horrible. Stalin could speak to people one-on-one and slowly win them over to what he wanted to do. And the story is that when Bukharin finally realized, and Bukharin had originally been a supporter of Trotsky and then turned against him with the others, when he realized that Stalin was basically picking them off one by one. He is said to have remarked to somebody about Stalin, he is Genghis Khan with a telephone. Meaning that, what he wants, it'll be done within minutes anywhere in the country. Langdharma was not Genghis Khan with a telephone. The idea that in 4 years he simply extirpated everything, I think, is untenable. So what happened? I think that what one would have to conclude is, first of all, this is the period when Langdharma is killed, the empire begins to implode. And it basically collapses. Now imagine you have an institution, think of educational institutions. I often like to say, think of a state university system, okay? And then imagine that the state goes bankrupt, okay? It's not the case anymore, but let's go back a few years and think of the city of Detroit, okay? The University of Detroit. I don't know if there is a University of Detroit. I'm sure there must be, but imagine that Detroit goes bankrupt. They basically have to cut all funding for the university. It's as if you were to say, oh, the mayor of Detroit hates education. He and his ministers have decided to do away with education or something. You essentially really have the collapse of the main central funding institution for all of this Buddhist activity. And it's thrown into chaos also by the politics and the material politics that surround this. In other words, is this really just a question of doctrine? A purely doctrinal question where some people prefer for argument's sake, let's just say the Pen religion, and some people prefer the Buddha Dharma. Is this what it's all about? That it's just a doctrinal question? And I guess you can guess the fact that I'm asking the question in this way means that with great professorial pomp, I will say, no, of course not. And it really isn't that, because this is what you have. The Tibetan emperor was not, if Langdharma was not Genghis Khan with a telephone, none of his predecessors were Genghis Khan with, with even 2 cans and a string running between them. This was not a system of absolute rule. The Tibetan emperor, and many people have remarked upon this, the Tibetan emperor was first among equals. That is, his power and his authority depended upon the nobility. There was all sorts of dependency there. People had their own little realms. In fact, the whole question about Tibetan society was the Dalai Lama presiding over a feudal society. This is rooted in all sorts of Marxist analyses, and most scholars outside the People's Republic of China, even the East European Marxist scholars in the 50s and 60s, when they talked about feudalism, they did not use that for the society over which the Dalai Lama presided, but rather they said the closest thing to feudalism in Tibet would have been the period of the Tibetan Empire. Feudalism is very decentralized, highly militarized, with all of these levels of dependency running up and down, and this is largely what one sees during the Tibetan Empire. Again, I'm always loath to use the term feudal simply because it's a very specific and technical term, and it has all these other connotations now that somehow get in the way. But if one talks about European feudalism in the same way that one can see in Japanese history something that seems to resemble it, in Tibetan history it is the period of the Tibetan Empire, in which it is really decentralized. So you have a society in which you have all of these things that link and bind independence, nobles and the emperor. They're all part of a common system. And that system is undergirded by certain commonalities of worldview. And belief systems are always part of that area, that worldview. So what happens with Buddhism, and you can disagree with me, of course I'll flunk you all, but no, but you can disagree with me, but what happens with Buddhism is that essentially it begins to provide a counterweight to the emperor's dependence upon the nobility through their common bonds within this indigenous worldview and indigenous belief system. It provides an alternative. And that, I think, is really what is at issue in the desire to do away with these pro-Buddhist emperors, and certainly the last pro-Buddhist emperor, and to place Langdharma on the throne. In other words, Buddhism provided an alternate system of legitimacy and even more so support, because economic resources within the empire were being funneled to a Buddhist establishment. And we see this in the late empire with decrees that every 7 families must support 1 monk. I mean, all of a sudden there is a withdrawal of economic resources and funneling them towards the Buddhist establishment, the nascent Buddhist establishment, which was very supportive of the emperor, because the emperors were becoming patrons of Buddhism, and it was a way also of beginning to loosen those bonds. Remember, it's first among equal, those bonds between the emperor and the nobility. And here comes the implosion. With the collapse of that central system, the economic base for Buddhism is severely damaged. That, rather than somehow Langdharma, within 4 years, being able to destroy just about everything, I think, and I've often thought that this is at the root of this. And so this leads to the implosion, the collapse of the Tibetan Empire. The Tibetan Empire was strong. Now it implodes from inside. The Tibetan Empire, remember, it was not just this very brief, and I say very brief, a 2-week occupation of the Chinese capital, although the Tibetans withdrew for logistical reasons and for strategic and logistical reasons, but generally remained within striking distance, 100 to 150 miles from major areas of along the Chinese border. And the Tibetans also occupied the Silk Road cities, which were extremely important economically. Extremely important for the economic base of the empire. They did not occupy them continuously, and of course there was always a fight, to maintain control of the Silk Road cities. But for significant periods, the Tibetans did retain control of the Silk Road cities, and of course the fact that Dunhuang has been, which is in Gansu province, has been the source of a tremendous cache of Tibetan documents, talks about the extent of Tibetan control over the Silk Road cities and access to the Silk Road cities. And also, even in today's Xinjiang, there have been old Tibetan documents found as well. So this is an extremely significant part of the picture. So, I should also note, and you can make of this what you will, but the Tibetan Empire collapses. It doesn't fall apart completely. In fact, you have the little fragments begin to spin off. It's not the end of Tibetan power, but the fragments begin to spin off. But we see fragmentation in the world around Tibet. Beginning of the 10th century, the Tang dynasty collapses. And China also undergoes division. So one might begin to see this as part of some sort of a general picture. You know, sometimes it seems, you know, you're looking at, you know, trends in different countries, and, you know, it seems that, you know, when the electorate moves right, it moves right in more than one country. I mean, the era of Ronald Reagan was the era of Margaret Thatcher, if I can put it that way. You see things begin to transcend borders. I don't want to say anything more than that, other than that I find it very interesting in many different situations to see this, but the Tibetan Empire collapses, and you see fragmentation all around. The Tang also comes to an end. Okay, so what happens next? This is the period of fragmentation. When I speak next time, which is going to be in November, I'll speak about the period which ensues after the fragmentation, when Tibetan Buddhism begins to take a place in the world beyond the Tibetan plateau, something which I think is extremely important and actually changed, if I may be melodramatic, it did change world history. But we're a long ways away from that. There are people who have written about Tibet during this period of fragmentation and afterwards as ultimately experiencing, shall we say, the degeneration of Buddhism. That this is where, and this is an old narrative which you should all discard. But in order to inoculate you, I'll tell you what it is. And the old narrative, of course, is that actually what happens, and it begins during the imperial period, is that pure, pristine Buddhism comes to Tibet and gets corrupted by this shamanistic, animistic, and again, the word pön pops up, which just infects it. And, you know, if you want proof of that, often and again, this is a very, very simplistic idea, and it's a very simplistic thing that people talk about. They'll say, well, look at Hinayana Buddhism. You know, go to Sri Lanka, you have the image of the, you know, the nice, pristine Buddha in meditation, and that's it. And go to Tibet, and what do you find in Tibet? Some monstrosity with 8 arms and, you know, numerous heads chomping on somebody's severed arm and stomping on a dead body. And of course the narrative is, well, what on earth could this have to do with pure, gentle Buddhism? Now, what is missing in this, of course, is that no religion remains static. The Buddhism of Sri Lanka in the 19th century was not the Buddhism practiced in India during the time, or just after the time of the Buddha. All religions change. I mean, it's one of these, I guess it's one of these hot button issues now in terms of fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic or other fundamentalism. Nobody is practicing Christianity the way it was practiced in the 1st and 2nd century. People may think they are, but they're not. And nobody is practicing Islam the way it was practiced during and after the time of the Prophet. Religion exists in human society. It is dynamic. Human society is dynamic. Religion is dynamic. The idea that somehow elsewhere the Buddhism of the time of the Buddha was being preserved, whereas in Tibet it was being infected with all of this horrible, frightening imagery that, you know, good God, you know, what on earth could this have to do with Buddhism? This is something which is picked up during the 19th and 20th centuries, a sort of how shall I say, it imposes a kind of logical teleology over things. And what is missing from that, and which has been corrected, okay, this has been corrected, what is missing from that is the realization of the fact that these sorts of images that you find in Tibetan Buddhism were actually present, maybe not in the exact same forms. Certainly someone like Gurkhi Gompo, you know, the Mahakala of the tent that appears during the Mongol period. But much of this was in Indian Buddhism, these wrathful forms, these multi-limbed and multi-headed deities. You'll find them in Indian Buddhism because Buddhism in India was dynamic. You have all of these developments. And what happens also during this period is the period of fragmentation, is there's no longer a central authority that is funding and, if you will, in that sense, very heavily influencing the process of Buddhism. You now begin to find all sorts of local Buddhisms, if you will, or local traditions popping up, but they are not divorced from Indian Buddhism. This is a period in which you have different Tibetans going to India. You as I'll say shortly, you also have Indian Buddhist masters coming to Tibet. It is a period of great fertility in terms of the thought and the processes that are going on here. Now, people used to say that, in fact, I've seen this actually even in the mid 20th century, that the fact that Tibetan Buddhism splits into these different sects is another indication of its degeneration. That this unified Buddhism, if you will, and again, I don't know if that's wholly appropriate, of the imperial period now is replaced by this very fragmented form of Buddhism that you find in Tibet, with different schools and different masters, when in point of fact, what this really represents is tremendous intellectual activity, tremendous engagement with ideas. And of course you're going to have different schools in that sense. And this also reflects what is happening in India. So, the idea that Tibetan Buddhism is some sort of diversion, misconstrued diversion from the true path of Indian Buddhism, has to be, I would say, rejected. But if you don't want to reject it, at least temper it with knowledge that, Indian Buddhism is not this monolith that endures for centuries and centuries. And in fact, Indian Buddhism also has its own great intellectual developments and intellectual activity. And the Tibetans, various Tibetan masters pick up from this. There's something which is very interesting about this collapse, the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, and then this period of fragmentation. The Tibetan royal line still has cachet. It is still very important. So the last emperor, Langdharma, his line ultimately, according to Tibetan historians, and I'll tell you something, it doesn't even matter if it's true or not. What matters is that people think that this is the way that it should be. They think that the royal line, is what is so important. So we wind up with his line continuing in Western Tibet, which ultimately gives rise to the kingdom of Gugay and the kingdom of Ladakh, all descending from that line. And that line is also very important in the revived Buddhist activity. Once the smoke and dust clears, as I say, the smoke and dust of the empire, once that clears, you have revived Buddhist activity. There is, I think most people know, the Tibetan the invitation from the kingdom of Gugay to the Bengali Pandit Atisha. Atisha comes to Tibet. He dies in 1054, but he does a lot to revive certain things in Tibet. And again, there is a very important lineal descent from Atisha in terms of schools. He becomes very important, but he's not the only one. Very often the narrative just says, oh yes, Atisha comes to Tibet and he revives Buddhism. There are other things going on as well. Something which is very interesting is that, for instance, you have Gongpa Rapse from Amdo. This is from from the eastern end. Atisha travels from India to West Tibet, from Bengal to Western Tibet, and then comes to Central Tibet. Then we also have Gongpa Rapse, approximately the same time, the 11th century, teaching Tibetans from Central Tibet who have gone looking for teachings. And by the way, it's very interesting that they go to the east. They go to the east because, for one thing, it says that teachings, of course, are still being preserved. one might not have the economic resources that existed during the imperial period, but now there are other places to get teachings nevertheless, because they are continuing. And one thing which then becomes very interesting is the way Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan Buddhist sects develop during this period. During the, say, 10th century, well, the 11th century, actually, the 11th century, the 12th century, the things that we begin to see are very, very interesting. Remember I said that the central authority is gone. And indeed, this is a period that in most formulations, people talk about it as the period of fragmentation, the period when Tibet splits. And there is no central authority. There is local authority. These nobles, in many instances, manage to maintain their local authority. And so you begin to see something that happens which is very, very, I think, very fascinating. In some areas where the nobility predominate, they predominate in their own areas. They become not simply patrons of Buddhism, which they do, but also, if you will, the font of certain Buddhist sects. That is to say, there are some Buddhist sects which arise, which are very much attached to local nobility. In other words, they are very much integrated into this new situation. And I think one of the most obvious examples is the Sakyapa. The Sakyapa sect is very much connected to the Kön family. It's apostrophe K-H-O-N, not C-O-H-E-N. They're very much attached to the Kön family. The Kön family is one of the great noble families that was part of the imperial structure. Indeed, when the first Tibetan monks were ordained, there were 7, they decided that they would take, this is the story, they would take 7 people, nobles, of course, and give them vows to see if they could indeed hold to their vows and actually be proper monks. Now, of course, this is part of the Buddhist historiography, which maintains that before Buddhism came, Tibetans were wild and savage, and it was Buddhism that tamed them. And you'll find this narrative in other forms as well, such as that, well, you know, for some people, that's why the Tibetan Empire came to an end. They adopted Buddhism, and that turned them into pacifists, if you will, which, you know, is not really true. And some people will say that's why the Mongol Empire came to an end, because Tibetan Buddhism showed the Mongols that really, you know, they should turn their gaze inward. You know, but this is not really the case. But nevertheless, you wind up with this sort of narrative saying that, and so it seemed uncertain whether Tibetans really could be monks, so wild and savage were they. And so you, in the story you have the 7 monks, and you know, there are certain things which happen, but in the end the 7 monks preserve the way, and you know, everybody's happy, and they say, okay, now, you know, I don't know, I don't want to be too flip about it, but there used to be these commercials for Colombian coffee on TV, in which the agent goes into the village and they, you know, everybody brings him, you know, the cup of coffee that, you know, from their own beans, and you know, they wait to see, you know, what El Exigente will say, and he sips it and he goes, it's good, and then a huge celebration. And you get sort of that sense, you know, from this narrative of the 7 trial monks, they made it, everybody celebrates. Of course, you know, in those commercials, they never showed what happened when he doesn't like the coffee. But but in any event, you know, you do have this narrative about the 7 trial monks. One of them was from the Kön family. One of them was from the Kön family, which tells us something about a certain amount of continuity and a certain amount of residual interest and, if you will, dedication to Buddhism. Because the Kön family, in their domains, becomes the family of the Sakyapa sect. Now, Buddhism here is also integrated, if you will, into the power structure. Now, I talk about this in very how should I say, politicized in material terms. And I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not denying the spirituality of Buddhism. Absolutely not denying it. But I am talking about questions of history. And there are material issues that do come to bear in questions of history. It has to do also with spirituality and with certain perceptions, because Buddhism does retain a very important legitimating feature, and we see this later on, of course, by means of which Buddhist initiation is perceived as conferring legitimacy. The acts of a Buddhist patron, which are become incumbent upon a lay ruler. This is also part of this view of Buddhism as bringing legitimacy with it. And this is something we begin to see. The Sakyapa family is very much allied to, the Kern family is very much allied to the Sakya sect. We can say it's sort of an in-house sect at this point. And the Kern family, of course, integrates the sect within the family structure. And as a result, the Sakyapa also have their, for want of a better word, enforcers. They also have their military and civil leaders. The family basically presides over a sect and also over a political authority, which does have, to put it in a very banal formulation, has a monopoly on the use of force, or is perceived to have the monopoly on the use of force in its own domains. This is not something which is unique. This is not something which is unique to the Sakyapa. The Drigungpa subsect, and again, for the if the names of all the sects and the subsects are not all that familiar, don't worry. The names are not what's important. I'm trying to get a pattern here. Okay, the Drigungpa subsect also has the very same sort of structure at about the same time. Now, the Drigungpa subsect, of course, is one of these sects which descends from the Kagyopa of Marpa and Milarepa and Gompopa. So it's in a different tradition and a different line of teachings, and also of different emphasis on Indian teachings than the Sakyapa, but nevertheless we find that the Drigungpa, again for an example, same thing. The Drukyel Kyura clan basically is the family sect of the Drigungpa, or the family operation, which supports the Drigungpa subsect. And they have their own military leader as well. And this is, of course, this is all within the family. This is something that I've looked at a number of years ago, and you find this is, it's extremely important for the sect to maintain its authority, to maintain its position and wealth. The Sakya military official was, or a civil and military official was the Pönchen. The Drigungpa called theirs the Gompa. And you really do get an idea from the text just as to how closely integrated the religious side was with the secular side. So that one or two instances in generations where it looks like there's no real heir to the position of Gompa. So they have the abbot, who is a member of the clan, essentially step down from the throne, give up his vows, procreate, and then retake his position. Well, no, I mean, there are some interesting things about this. There's one who he's put on the throne again, and he doesn't want to, or they want to make, I forget. I think they want to make him Gompa. He's the abbot. He doesn't want to do it, and he runs away. And I think in the text, I have to check. I may have this wrong. As to what had happened to him in Drigung, but he runs away to Wutaishan, Rio Tsenga. And the text, which is written a few centuries later, says he's still there. So anyway, so this is part of this emergence out of fragmentation. And I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that this emergence brings with it a realignment of powers, local powers, fragmented on the Tibetan plateau, and a dynamism to Tibetan Buddhism that this period of the 11th and 12th centuries is the period in which the Tibetan sects and subsects that we generally know are formed. And this is due to a period of tremendous intellectual activity. And this is also something which distinguishes Tibetan Buddhism and which plays a role later on in making Tibetan Buddhism something unique in the world around it. And what I want to say is that the Tibetan Buddhist interaction with India proceeds over centuries. There are some national Buddhism in which there's a very short and intense transmission, and then the Buddhism, that national school of Buddhism, as it were, begins to take on its own characteristics within its own country, and it proceeds along a different. It's Buddhist, of course, but it proceeds, to develop, in different ways. The interesting thing about Tibet is that from the imperial period up through this time, you have comings and goings of Tibetans to India, of Indians to Tibet. It is a much longer and more intimate, if you will, transmission of Buddhism, so much so that the developments that we see in Tibet do not represent a degeneration of pristine prime Buddhism, but rather Tibetans being part of the development of Buddhism in India, mind you, at a later period. This is, these centuries that I'm talking about are the centuries just before Buddhism largely disappears in northern India. But nevertheless, you have this going on for centuries, and ultimately it leads to, and this is what I'll talk about next time, the perception of Tibetan Buddhist masters as those esoteric masters par excellence, the ones who truly know Buddhist esoterica and Tantrism. And by the way, I should also say, the idea of Tantrism in Buddhism, a long time ago that people would say, oh yes, this is one of the degenerate elements that happens when you cross pristine Buddhism with this horrible animism, shamanism, blah, blah, blah. But of course, Tantrism, first of all, it's not uniquely Buddhist. It's like Gnosticism, which is not uniquely Christian. You have Jewish Gnosticism as well as Christian Gnosticism in the early centuries. And Tantrism is not uniquely Buddhist. There's Hindu Tantrism as well as Buddhist Tantrism, and it comes from India. It's not something that the Tibetans invented. There are Tibetan contributions to this too. Ultimately, of course, India becomes inhospitable for Buddhist pilgrims, but we're still not at that point. And Tibetan Buddhism does develop in many ways schools and ideas on its own, but by that time, the amount of Buddhist literature that has been transmitted to Tibet is really, really extensive. It's a tremendous amount. Now, while this is going on as well, there's something else which I think I should talk about. Part of this fragmentation, and that's what is going on in the East. When the Tibetan Empire collapsed, and it didn't collapse in one day. This is a slow process. This is a slow process which happens. People generally they fix the date on the assassination of Langdharma. These different areas essentially spin off on their own. There is a very open, I don't want to say barren, but very sparsely populated space between the center of the empire and the far reaches of the empire. And the far reaches of the empire are places along the borders of China. And of course, with this empty space, if you will, and I'm exaggerating, I know I'm exaggerating, but basically you don't have this one broad, urban or continuous band of population that goes from Lhasa all the way to the borders. These areas along the borders also wind up with their own ruling families, their own political organization, and their own relationship to Buddhism. One of the more interesting ones, there are a few that one can talk about, but I think one of the more interesting ones, and it gives you an idea of, what the effect of the Tibetan Empire was on people. I mean, the creation of Tibetans, if you will, as a people. One of these is the Tsongkha kingdom. Now, Tsongkha, I think most of you know Tsongkhapa, the Gelugpa sage. Well, he's actually Tsongkhapa Losang Drakpa, but he's called Tsongkhapa because he's from Tsongkha. And Tsongkha is this area quite, it's close to Xining. It's just that one could say, well, traditionally it's been just outside Xining, which is the capital of Qinghai. So it's really at the frontier of the plateau. And Tsongkha, like a number of other areas, was no longer part of a Tibetan empire. It was no longer part of a Tibetan empire, though things continued after the collapse of the empire. I don't know how many people are aware of the fact, but for about 100 years after the death of Langdharma, the Tibetan language remained a lingua franca in Gansu. We have letters from Uyghur Turks, and the Uyghurs of that time are not the same as the Uyghurs of the modern period. I don't want to get into this. This is not the Lhotse modern Uyghur library, so there's no point in going into that question here. But the Uyghurs used written Tibetan as a form of communication between themselves. This is the result of the empire, of the Tibetan Empire. And the empire and the memories of the empire didn't just vanish. So indeed we have the Tsongkha kingdom, and in the late 10th, early 11th century, there is a decision that the Tsongkha kingdom has to have a ruler who is authoritative. The powers that be, and we know this from Chinese sources. That's another interesting thing about what the fragmentation does, because Tsongkha is so cut off from central Tibet. We only have a few references in our standard Tibetan historical sources to the Tsongkha kingdom. Most of what we know comes from Chinese, because it's right on the border of the Sung dynasty. The Tsongkha kingdom decides that it needs a ruler, and so who do they choose? They install a young child on the throne. And this is all the way to the northeast, but the child whom they install on the throne has to be, and is, according to the records, a descendant of the imperial line. Now, what this means is that the cachet and the authority of the Tibetan imperial line still remains. And indeed, we see this elsewhere when we look at some of the other lineages. Chune, which is also on the frontier in what is now South Gansu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. Chune also has an origin story for its rulers, which puts them in the imperial line. Not directly in the imperial, they're from a branch of one of the figures from prior to Songtsen Gampo, had a brother, and that brother then becomes the progenitor of the line that eventually takes over in Chune. But this is much later. This is much later that this comes to be. Here we're talking about really the 10th century, 10th and 11th centuries, in which a young child is placed on the throne. He is brought from central Tibet. They make a search. They go to central Tibet and they bring a child who is said to be a descendant of the imperial line, and he is put on the throne of Tsongkha, and he becomes the ruler of Tsongkha. Again, it's. I don't want to relate this to modern ideas about nationalism, okay? But it does say something about commonality, about a recognition of commonality, about an idea, if you will, of some sort of ruling kinship, and the importance of it. In other words, the empire was still important. The Tsongkha kingdom, I hope I'm not losing you. I mean, I don't know, is this making sense? No, I mean, often when I'm in my classroom, I mean, don't get me wrong, you're all very attentive. I mean, I don't see, if this were a classroom, I know that over there in the back, someone would be, updating their Facebook page or something. But and some people would be falling asleep. But okay, I just want to make sure. Anyway, there'll be time for questions. The Tsongkha Kingdom. The Tsongkha Kingdom essentially becomes extremely prominent in its area. And it's a kingdom with a descendant of the Tibetan imperial clan on the throne. Something which is very interesting, as I said, we really know about this from Chinese sources. This child is mentioned in Chinese sources under the name, actually it's a character whose pronunciation, the first character, was argued about, but it really is pronounced Gusulo. I mean, in modern Chinese it would be Gusulo. And now he's been well studied, but mostly from Chinese sources. But he has been well studied, and there are a couple of biographies of him, modern biographies in Chinese. I believe Bianca Horleman has written about him, and a few others as well. Gusulo, people were wondering, well, what name is that? And there were even one or two people who suggested, oh, this must be the origin of Gesar. He must be Gesar, but no, the name is not Gesar. The whole Gesar thing is something else. I'm not going to go into it here, at least not today. But the Song Dynasty sources, which we have on him, make a note that his name means, and the term they give is Fuozi, son of the Buddha. And actually, Fuozi, if you look in modern lexicons, the Tibetan Chinese version of the Dictionary of Geshe Trita, he gives Fuozi that term. He gives it as the equivalent of the Tibetan Gyese, Gyese, which seems to be exactly what Gusulo is, Gyese. And so now it's generally accepted, in the field that his name was Gyese. And he becomes a very important ally of the Song Dynasty. And that's why we have as much material as we do in Chinese. But what is interesting is that he then has a son who takes power. And by the way, during his time, he keeps open the trade routes, which the Song desperately need, to the Uyghurs to the west in order to get horses. All throughout Tibetan, one of the things all throughout pre-modern Tibetan history, the trade between Tibet and various Chinese dynasties involving tea and horses is always a very, very important bit of business. The Song dynasty, besieged by enemies, eventually the Song, of course, as you know, they retreat to the south. And then you have again, this is a period of division. You have divided dynasties in the north, you have the Song in the south. But the Song do need horses. Horses were the tanks of the pre-modern world. Every military needed horses. Extremely important. And China was never a terribly good place for raising horses. For raising pigs, yes, but for horses, no. That you need the steppe. And you wind up with the Tsongkha state actually providing very good access to horses for China. And again, as people know, the commodity coming from China that is most commonly mentioned is tea. So it was a tea for horse trade. And so we have a lot of information about the Tsongkha kingdom. The Gyese or Gusulo is succeeded by his son, whose name is given as Dongzhan in the Chinese sources. But with him, we do have a reference. He appears in 2 or 3 Tibetan texts. One of them is the Depter Marpo. And in the Depter Marpo, he is called Tsongkha Zampo. Now, you may remember from a half hour ago, I mentioned the term Zampo, meaning emperor and not king. He's mentioned as Tsongkha Zampo Chenga, the title of Chenga, Chenga Dunchen, meaning great affair, great business, if you will, Dunchen, great significance. But he's there in Tibetan sources, and this is obviously the person who is spoken of in the Chinese sources as Dongzhan. But this is one of the few places in which we actually have a concordance, in which we can connect the Tsongkha kingdom as it is in Tibetan with what we have in Chinese. Or actually, it's one of the few places where we do have Tibetan language references to it. So I guess the point is that you have this real fragmentation, and these areas are spun off far away. And it's very interesting, the areas along the Chinese border, still retain, much in terms of the memory and the significance of the Tibetan Empire. Just beyond them, further in, it's very, very sparsely populated. And ultimately, the Tsongkha kingdom moves its seat to Xining, and then later on it falls apart in the civil war, and the Sung take Xining, and that's basically the end of the Tsongkha kingdom. In other words, it becomes part of the Xining, if you will, becomes part of the Sung, Sung-controlled areas, although Tsongkha beyond Xining still remains very Tibetan. But during this period, you don't have the sort of settlement outside of places like Tsongkha, the Xining, that you eventually do. And when the Mongol period dawns, my colleague Christopher Atwood has written about this. The Tibetans in the area are largely nomadic, and indeed to many Mongols and even to many Western missionaries and others, they seem to feel that the Tibetans are a kind of Turk, because they seem to be nomadic, unlike the other Tibetans whom they know. So this is something which it eventually changes. This eventually changes as population movement begins, which ultimately draws much of the Tibetan population to the east, but we're not there yet. We are at this point where the fragments of the empire that we have along the east, slowly, at least in the case of Tsongkha, we see that the kingdom is eventually destroyed, but this is a kingdom which has had to deal not only with the Sung, but also in very hostile relations with another state, which we refer to as the Tangut state. And the Tangut state becomes extremely important in its interaction with Tibet, because the Tanguts are Tibeto-Burman. They are a Tibeto-Burman people. What they do is establish a conquest dynasty, much as the Jurchen establish a conquest dynasty, the Khitan establish a conquest dynasty. This is all at the same period, which is then succeeded by, how shall I say, the greatest of all conquest dynasties, the Mongol Empire. But this is a period in which North China is basically an area where you have Khitan, Jurchen, and Tanguts. The Tanguts among them being Tibeto-Burman. And a very interesting transmission of Tibetan Buddhism to the Tanguts occurs. But this takes me into the realm of Tibetan Buddhism, that period in which Tibetan Buddhism spreads beyond the plateau. And for that, kids, you'll have to come back in November.